welcome in to another episode of the Big Rhetorical Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Woods. It's good to be here with you today. How are you? How are your classes going? How are your students? Don't complain about them. They're great people. They're there relying on you. The semester starts on a Monday. That's what we tell ourselves, sure, but the reality is that for a lot of instructors working in higher education, graduate students, contingent faculty, even tenured professors at universities with smaller English departments, the semester starts on the date of the pre-semester mini-conference. Did you have a pre-semester mini-conference this year? This is old hat for a lot of you. Hey, do you know Dr. Ben Harley? He's at Northern State University in Aberdeen, South Dakota. We're going to talk to him a little bit later as a part of our Emerging Scholar series. So hold on for that. We'll get to Ben. It's a great conversation. You'll want to hear it. But these pre-semester mini-conferences, these departmental and occasionally interdepartmental events, they might range from half-day workshops focused on the mission of the writing program to day-long conferences with breakout sessions led by your peers and colleagues in the department and from other institutional entities and offices like Student Services or the Writing Center. For me, these events have been a part of my professional development at my last three stops: ISU, where I'm at now, UAB, and the University of Montevallo. Last spring, I led my first session at one of these events and called "What Do You Know About Antecedent Knowledge?" It was a workshop designed to allow instructors the space to create assignments that they might implement in their classroom to approach the concept of antecedent knowledge with their students. This fall, just a few weeks ago, I, along with a peer, led a Q&A session with graduate student instructors working in the writing program at our pre-semester mini-conference this year. This was the second session I led, of course, after the one last year. But this was the first year I wasn't involved with new instructor orientation, all right? So I was excited to meet the new cohort. And I began planning. I wrote down a couple of things. But then I tried to think about how my own positionality, my own ability to impart wisdom, of which I think I have very little, would transfer to these probably exhausted, newly minted PhD students after a week and a half of orientation. So instead, I threw down the pen and decided to let the questions they had guide the conversation. During the session, this turned out to be a pretty clever idea, and my peer and I were able to answer pointed questions instead of blabbering on for a long time about our own experiences. But I did write three things down in the notes folder on my phone to make sure I worked into the conversation with the new cohort. I'll share them here now. One is to make sure to maintain an activity or an exercise routine. 2, meet everybody in the department. And 3, graduate school is constant professional development. So I'll walk through those really quickly, what I mentioned. 1, make sure to maintain an activity or exercise routine. For me, this has been so important to my success in graduate school. I play basketball with a couple of guys from the department. I run every day. And these are great ways to break up the monotony of study and also cultivate good mental health habits. You got to meet everyone in the department. My department is huge. We're talking 60, 70 graduate students, a full faculty. So I think it's important to meet everybody, get advice from everybody, listen to people in your discipline, outside your discipline. A nugget of advice you get from someone that's also a creative writer might really change your decision about something concerning graduate school. And finally, graduate school is constant professional development. So don't be a jerk to people. That's what I told them. The example I gave here was email responses. So you don't have to hurry and respond to every email that you get. And a matter of fact, you shouldn't. But you still need to respond in a timely and professional manner, and then let the skills you learn in doing so transfer to all aspects of graduate school experience. So I don't necessarily think the things I mentioned to the new cohort are groundbreaking or landmark or life-changing or whatever. A lot of it came from Gregory Colon Simons's highly recommended book, Graduate Study for the 21st Century. But I said them. I enjoyed meeting the new cohort. One day down the road, maybe perhaps something mentioned in that session will resonate with somebody who was present. So Dr. Ben Harley, we want to hear more about him. It was, again, a pleasure to talk to Ben. He's doing a lot of work with sonic rhetorics and sonic intimacy. As this project moves forward, I think that this conversation might be viewed as a turning point early on for the podcast and for this project. And we're excited to know Ben and learn more about him and see the work he does going forward. So here's my conversation with Dr. Ben Harley. So where is that in Illinois?
Rock Island. So it's northwest.
Northwest. Is that near Benedictine University?
No. So actually, Benedictine is outside of Chicago. It's in a small suburb called Lisle, which you might have heard of if you have a friend who lives in a bigger suburb called Naperville.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's got this little tract of land right there in the Chicago suburbs. And it was a really weird situation where the high school I was at in Springfield, Illinois, so down south, got bought out by a community college in Springfield. So they gave us a discount to go there. And then they got bought out by Benedictine University in Lisle. And so I got another discount to go there. So it was like this really weird happenstance. And I where, got some education paid for and some discounts. So I had to take the opportunity,
Yeah, definitely. And you got your bachelor's there in communications?
Yes, communications with an S. So later on, I'd be working with some folks in at the University of South Carolina, where we don't really have much of a distinction between our English faculty and our communication studies faculty. And so I had to be really specific that I majored in communications, which means like I did a lot of mass media, I did a lot of journalism, did some PR, did some marketing. And I really did love the hands-on nature of that study, right? So like I do some law and ethics classes and stuff where I had to kind of sit back and think, but there's also a ton of like, okay, grab this camera, go shoot this news story. I remember this kind of a silly example of what we got to do there, but there's video of me talking about our blood drive while they're taking blood out of me. And then the conversation went on so long that I got faint and they had to like lay me down instead of having me seated. And of course the editor loved that. And so that was on the news for a while.
Oh, wow. I'm assuming Benedictine is a Roman Catholic institution. How was that experience?
So actually I went to a Roman Catholic institution from kindergarten. So it actually struck me as fairly similar. Benedictines are really interesting because they are archivists primarily. So they're big on like archiving and preserving knowledge and education. So like we had manuscripts from Hildegard von Bingen actually in our in the monastery. And so it was kind of really cool. But to be quite honest, the monks were always kind of just in the background. Like we would have really interesting conversations with them occasionally. Like I remember this really long conversation about casuistry with a monk that was really interesting. But for the most part, like our classes were taught by scholars just like anywhere else, people with their PhD in their field. One thing that was like really amazing is there was a woman there I'm just gonna like avoid names just because I never know the ethics of saying someone's name on a podcast.
Sure.
But there was a nun there who had published. She had like 2 doctorates in the hard sciences after entering after taking up the nunhood, taking the veil, and she had written books that were actually banned from the Vatican libraries. And so as so you learn a lot about this kind of traditional Catholic whatever, but you also learn a lot about how to push against that and kind of this independent spirit. And that's something I really loved. And I think also the kind of complication, the ways in which people who are really entrenched in any kind of dogma understand its shortcomings and its complications and are working to improve it from within. So, I mean, it's a really, it was a great spot, but I would say a lot of that kind of religious stuff was more in the background than the foreground.
So then the curriculum wasn't necessarily built around Catholicism, or you had to, make your class and then go to mass and things like that. You weren't there doing that kind of stuff.
No. So when I was in high school, totally. When I was in high school, we had to go to mass every Friday. But even my high school was run by Ursuline sisters. And the motto of the Ursulines is Serviam, or I will serve. So the way that religion really made itself manifest there was that I needed 150 service hours to graduate from high school. And then at Benedictine, I think we just needed 50 service hours. And so, and that was kind of the most in which religion kind of entered the curriculum, was that we would have our kind of core humanities classes all had service elements that we had to kind of work with the community with, which was amazing. It was great.
Sounds interesting. I'll be honest. I'm a Baptist, a Christmas Eve Baptist from Central Alabama. So I'm completely enthralled when people start talking about monks and nuns, nunneries and things with certain names. It's kind of foreign to me, really. I mean, to be honest, it really is.
I mean, I'm one of these wonderful people. There's a whole group of us called who, when you're like, oh, what's your religion? We go, oh, I was raised Catholic, which is a weird way of saying oh, I know a bunch of stuff about religion, but also I'm not really religious. I had something I was going to go. Oh, but what's really funny to me is what non-Catholics know about Catholics. Because someone's like, oh, so are St. Peter's bones in the Vatican? I was like, we never talked about it. That's actually not an important part of what we believe.
I don't know where the bones are.
Yeah, exactly. It's no, and we never were sold relics or anything. However, I can name all of the mysteries of the Rosary. So
yeah, I can name all the members of Monty Python. So.
Yes, blessed are the cheesemakers. I remember.
Oh, so you're at Benedictine University. You've got your communications degree, and then you head west to the University of Northern Colorado. What city is that in?
That's in Greeley, Colorado, which is a little further from the interstate. But once you get on the interstate, it's 45 minutes from Fort Collins, about an hour from Denver.
Okay, so Fort Collins, is that where the Air Force Institute is?
No, I think that's Colorado Springs. Okay. I know there's a big Air Force base in Colorado Springs. Colorado State University is in Fort Collins, and then Boulder is where University of Colorado is.
Okay, I've never been to Colorado, but I do want to get out there. I know that you were studying English literature there. Your thesis was entitled Expansions of the Public Sphere, Terry Suarez and Mary Wollstonecraft. What was that project about?
Actually, this is the project that got me into rhetoric. So
okay.
Yeah. So I got into the English degree because I really liked the idea of being able to spend time looking at art, and I really like the methods of English, actually taking a text really seriously, looking at the context in which it was created, and really trying to not pull a definitive meaning out of it, but try to understand it better by taking it extremely seriously. And so that's what pulled me to English literature. And then my first semester there, I was taking a class called Literature and the Public Intellectual. And we read Mary Wollstonecraft's Treatise of the Rights of Women. And as I was reading that, I was like, oh, there's a band I've been listening to called Les Butcherettes that actually has a song called I'm Hungry for More Than Rousseau that is kind of leveling these same arguments against Rousseau and against this kind of thinking. And so I was like, oh man, like it's weird that when we talk about publics, we talk about them as in one specific time or place. But really, a public conversation utilizes text and builds off ideas that are centuries old. And so I use this kind of idea of Terry Suarez utilizing Mary Wollstonecraft. She even gives her a shout out in that song. I want to thank Mary W. for the inspiration, to kind of rethink this argument against Rousseau that kind of combines that time period in our own to kind of create a contemporary feminist manifesto in song. And so I really love this idea and wanted to study that. But then I had a conversation with my director, and she's like, well, how is that literature? And I was like, oh, I guess it's not. I guess it's cultural studies. And she's like, oh, we don't give a degree in cultural studies. So I was like, okay, I guess it's rhetoric. And then once I got into the PhD program, I had to backtrack a little bit more and figure out exactly what that meant. And it took me in different places. But also I'd had a great mentor at University of Northern Colorado who helped me, she ran our first year, first time teaching. It was to help new teachers understand what they were teaching in rhetoric and to learn pedagogy behind it. And that was such a positive experience, not only for me, but for my entire cohort, that I had really wanted to go towards rhetoric and composition anyway, just after that experience. So the fact that I could take those skills that I had learned in English, relate them to texts and situations I found more interesting, and also be able to really focus and have legitimized my want to teach composition classes and freshman composition classes, that move was extremely satisfying for me.
As someone who got their MA in English literature and postmodern African American literature, and then kind of moved towards rhetoric and composition, for me it was a moment. I was standing there at the University of Alabama, Birmingham as an adjunct, and I was like, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm doing. I'm standing in front of a composition classroom, and I'm like, I'm a writing studies scholar, and I have an English literature degree. So it's always interesting to me to hear how people kind of make that shift or fall into, the discipline.
Yeah, and I think it's really validating once for a lot of folks who don't know about comp rhet, in their undergrad. And they're into English or they're into communication or communications, and that's why they get there. But the idea that they really want to focus on writing and they enjoy discussing like how to put together an argument and how to communicate something to an audience. When you find out there's a whole discipline around that, it's like extremely, I don't know, for me it was joy. I was like, oh my God, I can do this, and like people take it seriously, and there's a whole bunch of scholarship that can allow me to do it better. That was amazing.
It's a great feeling. So you're at Northern Colorado, and then you make the move back east all the way across the country to Columbia, South Carolina, to study at the University of South Carolina. How's living in Columbia?
Columbia is a great city, and I moved into like the worst house they have. So it was good. There are weird things about in the South, like palmetto bugs and stuff, but got used to that real quickly. And, University of South Carolina was such a rich place, such an intellectually rich place to be. Classes where we were challenged, we were reading a bunch, but also like really generative discussions. And my entire cohort, we came together really well and would love to and would just get together and talk about these big ideas constantly and kind of help each other work through arguments and work through ideas. And so like once I found that community in Columbia, South Carolina, it was really like, oh, I know where I'm meant to be. Like I know that this is a place that's interested in the same types of questions I am, and people are gonna be nice about it and help me think through it and want to engage me with this stuff. And that was awesome.
You graduated with your PhD in May 2018, and your dissertation was titled Writing with the Risk, Dangerous Discourse, and Event-Based Pedagogy. We'll get more to your teaching later in the podcast, but really quickly, what in a nutshell, what is event-based pedagogy?
So actually, I took that from this book by Joe Panzer, where he's talking about Deleuze and John Cage, and he's talking about iterative music, this kind of music in which it's not about fidelity. It's not about kind of creating the same thing over and over again. Instead, it's about creating loose instructions that people can participate in, and thinking about music not specifically as like a composition that gets stored away, but as an event. And I wanted to think about the classroom in the same way, as something that like I kind of set the conditions of possibility, but I'm not trying to force students into one space or the other. And I think that's how a lot of people approach composition pedagogy anyway, but I wanted to really kind of think through it and really make sense of this idea for myself and others, so that people could think about, setting the conditions of possibility in a classroom and how to do that in a way that also kind of hedges on risk. We're in an age where, if you have students do blogs and people can access that, like what's the ramifications of that? What are the ethics there? And so I wanted to think about something that both enables this kind of free play, but also has a little bit of foresight for some of the risks involved.
It sounds like some of that work might be applicable to the different social media projects or social media activities that we do in our classes as well, or maybe even just signing up for a Gmail account,
Yeah, I mean, you were at this isn't a secret. You were at the Computers and Writing this summer. You did a whole podcast episode of it. And the keynote there, when he was talking about user agreements and having should we be asking students or requiring students to utilize technologies that might be tracking them, or that have these kind of long trails that they can't necessarily know what's going to happen with their text, their identities, or whatever. I think that those are really important questions, and I don't think I answered them with the depth that he did. I wish I could remember his name right off the top of my head. But that's his scholarship. I think is a great place to look for that.
So you left the University of South Carolina upon graduation, and you moved to Northern State University in South Dakota. Which city is that in South Dakota?
Aberdeen, South Dakota. You've never heard of it, but it is the third largest city in South Dakota.
Okay, the third largest city in South Dakota, Aberdeen. Well, I'm sure that's been a drastic change. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that experience coming off the job market at USC and then landing at Aberdeen in your first year as a faculty member there.
Yeah, I love Northern State University, and I'm really lucky to be a part of this community that serves this kind of more rural South Dakotan student population. And it's just really great to be a part of this and to work with the students that I'm allowed to work with. That said, the kind of preparation that they're getting in high school is different from that than they had at the University of South Carolina. Kind of expectations for, how every region of the country you go to has a slightly different mode of what it means to be polite. And so learning a lot of that stuff as well has been a bit of a learning curve. And so, an easy example is like a lot of my students had never thought about their essay writing as an argument before. And so at the University of South Carolina, I talk about, start very early on in a 101 or a 201 class about like, what is argument? But mostly what I'm doing is I'm refining a conception that they're already thinking about their writing. In Northern State, when I'm saying what is an argument, well, they're like, oh, well, I know what an essay is, and I've been writing these essays, but I haven't really been thinking about engaging with audiences in the same way. And so like that kind of definitional work is much different, and students enjoy, I think, thinking about their stuff as arguments, thinking about affecting audiences, and thinking about, well, how can I actually utilize this stuff in the real world? But it's a lot of stuff that they hadn't really thought about prior. And so the 101 classroom becomes this like really cool space where you get to explore this stuff for the first time and ask students like how they're thinking about this without having a whole lot of background in it.
That's got to be a heck of a lot of labor, though, to think about restructuring some of the ways in which you go about introducing information and the expectations that you might have coming out of one program and landing at another?
Yeah, I don't. That's an interesting way of putting it. And actually, I would say the more I labor, the worse it works out. I think this is a situation in which my students at Northern, they have so many experiences, they have so much that they bring to the table, that if I can open up the conversation, we can start talking about getting them to think about audience and argument and rhetoric, things that they hadn't really thought about ever before. I had AP exams throughout my entire graduate career, and so I kind of thought everyone knew, like all high school students were familiar with like ethos, pathos, logos, right? And so I was like skimming all over that stuff. I'm like, oh no, we need to stop and slow down and talk about this because it's not really talked about in South Dakota. And so I realized, like, the more I tried to be like, okay, here's what ethos is, and like here's like 5 examples of it, the more my students were just like, dude, too much. And the more I slowed down and we just like sat through one example and we worked through, I'm doing a lot more group work, a lot more group writing projects. And the more I do that kind of stuff, like the better the conversation is. And I think it's really just acknowledging the kind of wealth of information that my students have and bring to the table.
Absolutely. So we've talked about your education a great deal. Let's kind of move and focus on your scholarship a bit.
Sure.
I know that you've had late last year in December, you had Sounding Intimacy published in the Journal of Multimodal Rhetorics. I know that that's a project that you're excited about and continue to be excited about. What all was that project about?
So this actually came out of a sound class that I had with Byron Hawk in University of South Carolina. And it was this great class where we were talking about sound as a medium, and we were thinking about it kind of its material situation. So that class was run that we were kind of discussing how it's been dealt with in how sound has been dealt with in composition, simultaneously thinking about it as kind of a material medium, right? Like what does it do? And I was struck by this idea that like sound waves like permeate us, right? They like, sometimes they go through us and sometimes they bounce off of us, and how it resonates and reverberates is really in relation to bodies, and the bodies change the sound and the sound changes the bodies. And if you look at a lot of the kind of scientific work that's been done on this, you can see that like when people listen, they feel like they get a better sense for kind of other people. And like when we dance together, it like we feel really bonded together. So like if you and me were to dance, like we'd feel closer. And if we did it in sync, it'd be a little even more so. And like if it's like really rigorous dancing, that even creates more bonds. And so like there's something really cool to me about not just sound as this particularly intimate medium that kind of permeates bodies, but also about like all these social activities that surround sound that kind of make it this really interesting medium. So I wanted to kind of explore that in this piece. And I'm not the first person to do it, actually. As I kind of, it's one of those things where after you get on the project, while you're researching it, I realized like, oh, Dominic Peckman's doing really cool work with this. But then kind of afterwards, I was like, oh, Tina Camp did really cool work with this. Trish Nicole Campbell did really cool work with this. Like there are a bunch of scholars who are thinking about intimacy. I mean, even Steph Sarasso, I don't know if she uses the word, but she talks a lot about that same kind of stuff. Byron Hawk's new book, Resounding the Rhetorical, does a lot of this work. And again, I don't think he uses the word intimacy, but it's again thinking about sound in relation to body. So I wanted to kind of explore that, and I wanted to do it with sound. I love doing these kind of sonic compositions. I love being at this podcast, by the way. Love what you're doing here. So like, yeah, I want to explore it that way.
So for those that want to check out that Sounding Intimacy, it's in the Journal of Multimodal Rhetorics, Volume 2, Number 2. That's December 2018. So that was last year. It's August 2019 now, right? Classes are starting. What are you working on now? What are we looking for? Where's your research focused at right now?
Oh, I love that. What have you done for me lately question. Yeah. So I have something out for. I just got revised. What is that? An R&R. What does that stand for?
Revise and resubmit.
Thank you. Do you remember the Ghost Ship fire a few years back?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was this club in LA, and it was like, it was an underground club. Like, it wasn't officially licensed by the city or anything. And it caught on fire, and like 36 people died. It was extremely sad.
Yeah.
And then on 4chan message boards, a bunch of alt-right guys got together and were like, oh, we can call fire departments and close down more of these clubs because these are like, quote, hotbeds of liberal activism. And so I was like, oh man, that's crazy, right? Like they're closing down these places, and then like a bunch of clubs closed down, like Rhinoceropolis. There was a spot in Baltimore, Glass Menage. Like there were a bunch of places that then closed, and like you can't say for sure it was because of the alt-right, or if it was because businesses were trying to gentrify those areas, or if it's because of safety concerns, or if like those three things overlap in weird ways, right? But I became really interested in this question of like, why these spaces? What does the alt-right have against these spaces in particular? And like some of it really is because like, you know, they'll allow people to have Black Lives Matter meetings, or they will serve as homeless shelters or community literacy places, or because, you know, people from the LGBTQ community or people of color or musicians of color will be in these spaces. A lot of it's because of that, but a lot of it's also just because like music is this intimate way in which we make connections with people across difference. And like, I think just ideologically, the idea that people are doing this, and that specifically making music, like that's what all these places have in common, is that they're places where music is made. And you know, I think that not music necessarily is anti-fascist, right? Like fascists use music too. But I think that if you have a spot where music can be made that helps to bring people together, and music is such an effective way of doing that, that it becomes really frightening to groups that thrive when people are scared of each other and don't want to connect with one another.
Man, that's really poignant. I mean, I really like that. I think that's important. And I agree with you 100%.
Thanks. I mean, I was an old scene kid back in the day. Like, you know, every Friday at the punk show, every afternoon in my buddy's garage for band practice.
You got the monks to like drop you off, you know, like down the street from the punk show.
You know what? Yeah, I remember once I showed up in my uniform, and like it was a really weird mix of people thinking like, that's awesome, and like, who the fuck is this kid?
This has been a long gestating project is what you're saying.
Yeah, you know, so actually I'm in a writing group right now with a couple other scholars, and Trevor Meyer, actually, he's going to be on your on the podcast, right?
Yeah, I'm talking to Trevor later this month. I know you guys have done some things together.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So me, him, and a couple other folks are in this writing group together, and they really pushed me to get more of myself into when I'm writing about the punk scene, right? So I was originally writing about this kind of like step back, and I'd be like, okay, well, here's the case study, here's the alt-right, and they're like, dude, you don't sound like you don't sound like you actually know what the fuck's going on, like, be a punk kid, dude. And so I was like, fuck it. So I kind of wrote this piece trying to utilize that ethos. And then I'm working on a piece I'm working on another piece that's a sound piece, talking about, what the hell's that piece about? Just kind of talking about ways in which we talk about publics as these stable and homogenous things. We need to think about them as more diffuse, and we need to think about them as part of the networks, part of these like larger social networks, and we don't really do that very well. And so I'm using my old punk scene in Springfield, Illinois as a case study for this. And so again, they're like, you got to use your voice. You got to kind of push your kind of non-academic experiential knowledge of this stuff if you want people to be interested. And so kind of learning to do that has been really, it's been something I've been working on this year.
So I want to go back to the work you've done with Trevor Meyer. I know that you all have done a few things together, like you mentioned, you're in the group, but you had an invited talk that you all did together. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so me and Trevor both went to the University of South Carolina. He was 1 year ahead of me, and we had TA positions at the University of South Carolina. And so one of the things we were asked to do was to help with most of what we did was like textbooks and setting up textbooks, setting up classes, and helping to mentor specific students. But we'd also help with the orientations. And so we went to, I don't remember when that was, a few years back. We did a piece on the greatest hits and misses in freshman comp. That was 2 years ago. And
Great title. Great title.
you know what? I wish that was mine, but I think that was actually the assistant director of first year English who came up with that. And this is actually really interesting because it was right after the 2016 election, and that was just such a pall over everything else. So we talked a little bit about mistakes, but mostly we just ended up talking about like, what are people's fears? Like, what are the things that people are scared about messing up or getting wrong or having happen in the first year composition classroom? And we opened it up and we talked about a lot of problems that people had and ways to deal with problems as they rise. And it's one of those where I don't know if anyone learned anything, but I think we all left feeling better, like more prepared. Whether or not we actually learned anything, like it got us in a good mental space.
You mentioned the textbooks you all used down at South Carolina, and I know just from looking at your CV that you have the Carolina Rhetoric, and you were the editor of that textbook. But it looks like it was a change from the Carolina Reader to the Carolina Rhetoric. Was that something you were involved in?
Oh, okay. So actually, the Carolina Reader is our 101, and our Carolina Rhetoric was a 201.
I see.
And so the 101 we've been doing in-house for a while, but we ended up wanting to make a big change on that. Like, we wanted to run it because there are 4 assignments in that sequence, and so we wanted to redesign it so it was 4 units, and each unit was like, here's theoretically what we're trying to do. Here's an example of someone doing it. Here's some text you can read so then you can do that type of analysis. So it was like a close reading analysis, a social cultural reading, a visual reading, whatever. And then, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. And then the 201 we hadn't been doing in-house, but there was some discussion about we could do it in-house. And I, being overly ambitious, was like, yeah, we should just do it like fully us. It'll be great. And I had this idea that we could set it up based on the 5 canons of rhetoric. And we could have graduate students and faculty write excerpts on each on different facets that we would put under the canon, right? So under invention, we might put like topoi, and we talk about topoi. And we kind of figured also that would spread the workload around. And so me and the director, so I kind of set up this and asked for people who would want to write, and the director helped me to review what everyone had written, and then they re-revised, and we kind of organized all that. And so the first part was all these kind of like scholars of rhetoric, whether they be faculty or graduate students, writing about rhetoric. And then the second part was just like readings that students could kind of either use as examples or they could write about. And so getting the readings is really weird because like some of it was stuff we had read like out in the world, some of it was stuff that we'd gotten from a scholarship, and then a lot of it was like reading through essay collections and trying to find things that we thought would work, and reading through like other textbooks and being like, oh, this essay's really cool, like we'll ask for that one. And so that was a great experience.
How's the textbooks different from Carolina and what you were doing there from Northern State?
So that's interesting. Not using in-house textbooks anymore, I was able to kind of choose whatever textbooks I'd want. So when it comes to like my 101s, my 201s, for my 101, I use Writing That. Nope, that's a lie. For my business writing classes, I use Writing That Works. Do you as well?
I do. I use Writing That Works as well.
Dude, so good. Kind of looking at something from a rhetorical situation.
Sponsor the show, Writing That Works.
I just assume they're going to send me free copies now.
This is how you get desk copies of textbooks. You come on the Big Rhetorical podcast.
I figured this had to be a cash cow for you. Uh, y'all can't see him just shaking his head vigorously right now. Okay, so my 101 textbook, I actually used Green and Lindinsky. I really like that book. And it's a little more processed than the books that we would use in South Carolina. I think that is one of those things that is like a strength and a weakness. It's a trade-off. But it does help my students kind of work through a lot of the processes. For my 201, I just started using, and I haven't used it yet, I'm going to be using it in the fall, is Cheryl Ball, and there are two other authors on there, writer-designer. And that book I haven't used before.
It's Kristen Arola and somebody else.
Shepard is the last name.
Shepard. Ryan P. Shepard, maybe?
No.
I should get up and go get it off my bookshelf.
Yeah,
it's
give me one
literally
second.
like, yeah. Jennifer Shepard. We're sorry, Jennifer Shepard. You are not Ryan P. Shepard. You're Jennifer Shepard.
Yeah, but that book, so it's really weird. I haven't taught with that book yet. I'm very excited to. But I run a pedagogy reading group because a lot of folks, when I got to NSU, they're like, oh, like we're all trained in literature and we're good. And they're good writing teachers. Like, I don't want to say they're not, they're very good writing teachers, but they're all like, hey, we want a little bit more work, a little more training. And I was like, dude, you want me to assign readings and then talk about pedagogy every other week? Hell yeah. And so we get together, we talk about pedagogy, and we were kind of working through, we were working through like Shipka and Self and, that kind of stuff. And
Right.
they were getting it, but they were having a hard time being like, it was the Monday morning question. Like, how is this going to help me on Monday morning? And so I was like, okay, I'm going to order this textbook for everybody. And like, we're going to talk about the assignments you can create with it. We can talk about like, what is multimodal? Like, let's answer the Monday morning question. And that textbook really did. And so my pedagogy group loved it. And then I went and gave this lecture to the Rising Scholars program, which is like in South Dakota who teach dual credit English classes. And so I went and gave a whole day workshop on rhetorical analysis and multimodality, and I got them desk copies of that book too. And I was like, hey, like, check this out. And I've gotten such positive responses from those two groups that I'm like just super excited about using it in my classroom.
So we'll talk more about what you're teaching this upcoming fall, but what other scholarship have you got going on? I see you're going to be in Bozeman, Montana. I've never been to Montana before. At the Western States Rhetoric and Literacy Conference coming up. What are you going to be talking about there?
Okay, so I'm going to be talking. The conference theme is on mindfulness, and I don't know a ton about mindfulness, but a scholar in the music department, Great Stewart at the University of South Carolina, he came into Byron's music sound class and kind of talked about how he looks at sound, and we ended up doing this really cool meditative exercise where like we kind of turn the lights, we dim the lights, and close your eyes, and you like pay attention to your breathing, and then like whenever you're feeling it, you just start making sounds. And then when you're done making sounds, you just stop. And when everyone's done making sounds, then the music's over. Okay. So it's like this musical piece that's built on like really vague directions. And so we ended up doing this in Byron's class, and it was like calming, and it was communal, and it was like just this awesome experience. So I was like, okay, like let's take that to the workshop and kind of have people do that. And then let's loop in people from other times and places doing this exact same meditative exercise. So we're breathing together as the community that's there, but we're also sounding together with this like larger community that's absent, but their voice is present. And my question is like, do we feel that same type of connection, or does having that outside somehow, by paying attention to that larger network that we're a part of, like, does that throw the meditation off, or does that make it deeper? And I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not going to know until we do it in Bozeman. And then we're going to talk about it. So like, I'm super excited about it. And I've been trying to just do more workshops. When I was at Computers and Writing, we did a remix thing where we kind of made a bunch of sounds together, and then we made sonic collages of them. And I love doing these kind of more participatory workshops at conferences. I think that it's a great way for people to invest, and the kind of work that you have to do for these is a lot different than setting up the essay, right? And it's a bit difficult because you can't just like take a chunk out of what you're working on and be like, okay, I can just read this, right? You need to really kind of think about this. This is a very particular place. But the rewards and the kind of how generative it is just super, super wonderful.
You're going to have to check back in after this workshop and let us know how it goes. The semester is creeping up for some of us. It's already begun as we're planning our classes. What are you teaching this fall?
Actually, this fall, it's just 101s and 201. So my 101 is really cool. We're doing a bunch of rhetorical analysis stuff, working through that. My 201, I'm like super excited about because I have been talking to some librarians and kind of partnered with a library to do some archive work. So what we're going to do, my students are going to kind of question, like, what is literacy and what does it mean in the 21st century? And so the first thing they're going to do is their literacy narratives, take some time to think about what is literacy, what's my experience, and they're going to create these kind of multimodal literacy narratives. And I'm going to ask them, they're not required, but they're encouraged to submit them to the literacy narrative archives, or the Digital Archive of Literacy Narratives.
The DALN, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to encourage them to submit there. Then, once they've kind of done their own like reflective work, I'm going to ask them to think about, okay, this is how you think about literacy. How has the community that you're currently a part of traditionally thought about literacy? Like, how have we taught it? What are kind of the literacy practices? What are the values? And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go into NSU's archives, and they have stuff from South Dakota, Brown County, Aberdeen, and NSU. And we've kind of broken it up into different aspects, right? So like Brown County newspapers, Aberdeen newspapers, syllabi, no, they don't have syllabi, but course lists from NSU, course lists from local high schools. And we're going to talk about different ways that they can analyze these things to get a sense for what was valued or what literacy practices were. So they might look at the newspapers and say like, okay, well, this is kind of how they were laying out. Like, this is the how much text versus how much photo. This is kind of how they were writing their headlines. Or they might look at the course offerings from a high school and be like, okay, well, these are the kinds of literature classes. These are the kinds of writing classes that they thought were worth teaching. And yeah, go ahead.
When you design, you go ahead, actually.
Okay. I don't know exactly what my students are going to create. I wanted to make sure that I have enough guidance and enough tools that they're not lost, but I also want them to be able to follow their own interests when they do this. And so working with the librarians has been really useful here because they know the archives. They know so much about how to work with these sets. And then I'm kind of bringing these definitions of literacy and these way to think about these kind of artifacts. So between the two of us, I think that we're going to have a pretty good class.
When you design a project like this, where you go into the archives, what kind of things do you do to make sure that we're accessing the data and looking at the archives ethically?
Great. So that's a really difficult question.
It is a super difficult question.
And besides the fact that it's a difficult question, and that one that like rhetoricians and rhetoric scholars are currently grappling with, it's also a difficult question because how do you do that in the course of a semester, especially when so much of the time in this semester is like 3 weeks? I'm really not lecturing. They're just in the library because at NSU, a lot of our students work or have athletics. 30% of our school, I think it's 30% of our students are athletes, and a lot of them work, and a lot of them are non-traditional. And so I need to give them time in the archives. I cannot assume that they have the free time to do that on their own. So like 3 weeks are just in the archives, So how do you do that in this space? So we're reading some stuff from the National Archivist Association. There's this great piece from the national parks dealing with their archives, and there's this kind of wonderful write-up about like what's the purpose of an archive, And so my students are going to read that and get a good sense. The librarian is going to talk about kind of treating the materials. And then actually we're not reading, we're listening to another podcast, Ideas on Fire. There's an interview with Tina Campt where she's talking about listening to photos. And like, that's a method that's really specific to her. But what comes through that conversation is this idea of care, right? And so not just care of the materials, but care for the people you're writing about, for the communities you're writing about. Think about the kind of the ways in which they're vulnerable. Think about the ways in which you can misrepresent them. Thinking about, and the other thing is paying close attention. When she's talking about listening to these photos, she's talking in part, and I don't want to, listen to the podcast. Like she obviously articulates this better than I will. But one of the things she's talking about is taking great care to pay attention to the things you might not otherwise, to kind of letting yourself be open to understandings that you might not otherwise see. And so I think hopefully that we take this kind of idea of care and both caring and being careful, and hopefully we take that to the archive.
Yeah, and an ethic of care, right? Absolutely. So, Ben, anything else you want to add before I let you get off here and go enjoy that nice South Dakota afternoon?
Man, I already got to wear a hoodie.
Oh, yeah. It was cold last night on our back deck.
No, I just want to say I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I listened to a bunch of episodes before doing this, and it's been awesome to be able to listen to these emergent scholars. I love the From Computers and Writing episode. It's just kind of wonderful, and I think it's awesome that you're doing this. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Ben, and thanks for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
All right, that was my conversation with Dr. Ben Harley. I really enjoyed talking to that guy. Really a smart guy. We met each other. He let me know. I felt ridiculous. I had forgotten. We met each other at Computers and Writing this year at Michigan State University. After we talked, I actually remembered meeting him. So, Ben, I do remember meeting you. As we were on our way to record at Computers and Writing bowling night, I ran into Ben, so it was great to catch up with him, and I look forward to seeing the work he does in the future. Okay, so that's another episode of the Big Rhetorical Podcast Emerging Scholar Series. Perhaps you'd like to join us. Are you about to hit the job market, or you want to talk about your dissertation project or a recent publication? Shoot us an email. Reach out to us. We want to talk to you and acknowledge your labor and your commitment to the field, to the discipline. This Emerging Scholars Series will offer you the opportunity to contribute to the ongoing conversations in rhetoric, writing studies, and technical communication. For scholars and practitioners, the Big Rhetorical Podcast Emerging Scholars Series offers the opportunity to gauge the future of the field, of the discipline. The Emerging Scholars Series core ideals are similar to a community-based writing project, with an emphasis on inclusivity, in localizing knowledge, and in strengthening relationships among peers. So make sure you go and seek out the work of Dr. Ben Harley. You can find him on Twitter, and we'll be excited to see the work he's doing going forward. Okay, that's it. I feel good about it. I'm going to put it out there. Until next time, be kind to one another, and always be listening